Hello, and welcome back for another Torah Tuesday. It's been a number of weeks since I've recorded any of these videos. Although you've still had Torah Tuesdays coming out, you might have noticed that I'm wearing the same clothes week after week. That's because I record in batches of 3 or 4 at a time, so that I don't have to keep setting up and prepping for it throughout the month. So I have been traveling. My book came out. My husband and I have been celebrating our 25th anniversary. So there's been a lot going on, but I'm excited to be back with you. I think we've resolved the sound issues that plagued the last couple of videos. I'm sorry for the sound quality that was less than ideal, but I think we're back on track. And we've come to the end of the third cycle of signs. We've had the signs of locust and hail, and now we're going to look at the sign of darkness. And I'm going to begin by, as usual, reading my translation of the Hebrew text. And we're just going to cover the first 3 verses of the sign of darkness today. So reading from Exodus chapter 10, verses 21 through 23. So Yahweh said to Moses, "Stretch out your hand against the skies and let there be darkness over the land of Egypt. Let darkness be felt." So Moses stretched out his hand against the skies, and there was an ominous darkness throughout the land of Egypt for 3 days. No one could see each other. No one got up from their place for 3 days. But for all the Israelites, there was light on their dwellings. We've been talking throughout this series of signs and wonders in Egypt about how there has been a gradual increase in intensity from each one to the next. What started out as relatively minor, just an inconvenience of having to find different water sources, dig for their water at the beginning, and then the frogs in their homes, which were kind of gross, but not actually harmful, that things progressed to become more and more devastating, so that there was physical harm, loss of crops, loss of life, animal life. So it might seem a little bit anticlimactic to come to this one and say, darkness, that's it? God's going to shut out the lights for 3 days? How is that worse than what's just happened with the locusts and the hail? So what we need to do is dig into the ancient Near Eastern context, the Egyptian context, to consider what would this have meant to the Egyptians? What would this have meant because of their cultural context and their lifestyle? What would it have meant in light of Egyptian religion? And how does it fit in with the wider scope of what God is demonstrating in Egypt? The first thing to say is that many scholars have tried to suggest that this is actually a sandstorm, so it's another weather event. These sandstorms crop up around the Middle East in sandy areas, and they're called a khamsin. And so it's possible that this would be a khamsin, that is, the sandstorm would be so dense that they couldn't see the light of the sun for 3 days. And that would certainly be palpable, because if you went outside, you'd be cut by the sand. However, I don't think there's any textual warrant for calling this a sandstorm. There aren't any clues in the Hebrew text that we're talking about sand or wind, just that darkness has come over, an ominous, gloomy darkness. And clearly, along with the other signs and wonders, this is a supernatural event. So we don't need to go looking for a natural explanation for it. Now, would this have been no big deal to the Egyptians? Well, imagine yourself living in an Egyptian society where you have to go to the public well to draw your water, to public toilets to relieve yourselves, maybe to bathe as well, where there is no indoor electricity, no indoor lighting other than lamps, oil lamps, and where all work would have to be done during the day when natural light is available. And you can begin to see how significantly disruptive this would be to Egyptian society. In this time period, darkness would have been viewed as being hostile to life. If you think back to Genesis chapter 1, when God creates everything, the first thing he does is create light to push back the darkness. There's a sense in which darkness is against life. It's hostile to life. And so by having the darkness encroach again upon Egyptian society, it's a kind of anti-creation, anti-life. we're going back to the pre-creation darkness, at least where the Egyptians are living. Where the Israelites are living, there's light on their dwellings. So again, there's a separation between light and darkness, but light is only where the Israelites live. Darkness throughout the Old Testament is at times a sign of judgment, God's judgment. One example that I especially appreciate is Isaiah 58:10. It uses the same word for darkness that we have here in Exodus 10, and it refers to a way of releasing the darkness or getting relief from the darkness. Isaiah 58 says, "If you spend yourselves on behalf of the hungry and satisfy the needs of the oppressed, then your light will rise in the darkness, and your night will become like the noonday." It's such an interesting passage to compare with this because we are in a situation in Egypt in which the Israelite people have been oppressed by the Egyptians for many, many years, several generations. And by sending darkness on Egypt, God is trying to wake up the Egyptians so that they can see the error of their ways. And you can almost hear Isaiah's voice ringing in the background. If you want light, then stop oppressing others and set about to fulfill their needs instead. In the Egyptian context, there is another layer of significance that I think is really compelling, and that is this. The chief god of the Egyptian pantheon is Re, also known sometimes as Ra or Atum, and Re is the sun god. He is seen as the life force of Egypt, the one who keeps everything running, and Pharaoh himself is called the son of Re, or he's referred to as my son, S-U-N. So by turning out the lights for 3 whole days, Yahweh is in effect defeating Re, making it clear that Re is unable to shine. There was an Egyptian myth that pictured Re as traveling in a boat and circling over the land. So the land is here, and Re would go through the underworld at night in a boat and then cross the sky during the day. And by not being able to cross the sky during the day, it would suggest the death of the sun. It's now in the underworld permanently. And it would also signal the defeat of Pharaoh, who is Re's counterpart on earth, the one who's supposed to be maintaining Ma'at, or order, in his realm. So this might seem like not that big of a deal to us, but in an Egyptian context, to turn out the lights is a very poignant way of showing Yahweh's superiority over the gods of Egypt and over Pharaoh himself. One last thing that I think is significant here in the verses that I read is that the darkness lasts for 3 days. Now, what's the significance of 3 days? We've had 3 days before in the book of Exodus. 3 days is the length of time that Moses requested that the Israelites be allowed to leave to go serve Yahweh in the wilderness, in the desert. And Pharaoh had continually said no, and he had accused, back in chapter 5, he had accused Moses and Aaron of stopping the people from their work, of letting them Sabbath. And he said, no, the people are lazy, quit stopping them from their work. So Pharaoh was so greedy as a taskmaster, he would not give the people time off. And here God shuts out the lights and gives them 3 days of vacation, a fascinating response to the very specific sin of Pharaoh of failing to give them any rest. So that is going to foreshadow what's coming. The same God who can shut out the lights and give his people a rest can also get them out of Egypt and give them a permanent rest. But this is another warning to Pharaoh that if he doesn't comply with Yahweh's demands, things will go in the direction that he hadn't wanted them to go. And there will be a more permanent disruption of Egyptian society, and permanent disruption in the sense that his slave labor force will escape and not be available to do his work anymore. Now we're going to wait until next week to finish up this sign. But I think it's worth just mentioning that the Egyptians were not able to leave the house for 3 days because that's restraining the oppression of Egypt. All of the taskmasters were stuck at home. Nobody could go anywhere or do anything. Nothing could be produced in Pharaoh's Egypt. And that is precisely what he was trying to avoid by not letting the people go. And now God got his way anyway. So next week, we'll finish up the sign of darkness and find out what happens. Until then, have a great week.